I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Jeff Owen. He's going to be our presenter. He's the Area Extension Forestry Specialist from North Carolina State. I think he told us he'd spent somewhere short, just over 30 years with the university there, and most of it with Christmas tree production. And so he's going to talk to us a little bit about Christmas tree production and possibly some of the care and just the industry here in the Southeast. And so, Jeff, I will turn it over to you. I will make a comment is if anybody has questions, post those in the chat and we'll try to ask those as we get to the end of his presentation.
That sounds great. Are you all able to hear me okay and see my full screen?
Yes, we're good on my end.
Okay, and as Jason said, I'll be talking to you about Christmas tree production throughout the Southeast US, but of course, using my own experience with North Carolina growers as the foundation for that. So I think there's a lot of commonalities with certain parts of our states. So first, I'll be giving you an overview of the national and state Christmas tree industry, and then hopefully make that connection to Tennessee. I'd like to talk to you all about the potential for choose and cut farms in your own counties. And then I'll finish up with a short discussion of how best to select a fresh tree, whether you're looking for a tree for yourself, or in the case of the county agents, they might need to help a consumer make those decisions. And then finishing up with proper care for Christmas trees in your home. And of course, the picture in the lower corner of those bright green trees, those are Leland Cypresses, and they really can make a very beautiful Christmas tree. We spend a lot of time talking about trees, but I've got this slide in here to remind us all that, a crop is a crop, and it's really all about the people. This is a picture of one of our recent Eastern North Carolina Christmas Tree Association meetings. So moving on to Christmas tree production in the United States. It's always a bit of a guess, but we estimate generally between 25 and 30 million Christmas trees sold each year. We estimate that it's over a $1.3 billion industry in terms of annual revenue, representing something in the neighborhood of 15,000 farms across the country. Those farms employ over 100,000 full or part-time employees. Those farms represent about 865,000 acres of land in Christmas tree production. And there are Christmas tree farms in all 50 states, including Hawaii and Alaska. So to brag a little bit on the North Carolina Christmas tree industry, we are ranked second in US production. Generally, we talk about 4 to 5 million trees being harvested annually. I think that falls a little bit short when you consider tabletop trees and also the amount of trees going into the greenery industry. Our North Carolina industry is reported at being somewhere between $90 and $100 million a year. Again, that's probably a little bit conservative. Christmas tree farmers tend to hold their cards pretty close to the chest. I am a lot more confident in saying that 96% of our statewide industry are Fraser firs grown in the mountains, mostly from 6 counties. And you can see just a small part of one of our mountain Fraser fir farms here with different blocks of different aged trees. North Carolina Fraser fir are shipped nationwide. We have about 850 Christmas tree growers in North Carolina, as reported by the Ag Census. And we do have Christmas tree farms in every county, from the high country in the mountains down to the coast. There's a big difference, though, when you consider eastern Christmas trees versus those produced in the mountains. And really, they're almost two completely different types of industry. I'll talk about the Piedmont and coastal plain areas first. And this is the part of the state that would correlate more closely with the majority of Tennessee. You do, of course, have some East Tennessee mountains that match up with our North Carolina ones, and do have quite a bit of production there. But in our Piedmont and coastal plain, we have about 100 farmers. Most of them are hobby or part-time businesses. Most of the farms have 2 to 5 acres of Christmas trees. They may have more land in forest or other crops. Most of the labor on these small farms is provided by growers and their families. And as such, it becomes a really important fabric for the entire family, and brings them all together to work and support that harvest every year. Almost all the farms are choose and cut. We do have farms that combine Christmas trees with woody ornamental nurseries. But either way, they're consumers that are buying individual plants at the farm. Usually there's a wide variety of species being grown on these small farms. When you consider the industry in the mountains, it involves a lot more people. At one time, there were over 3,000 growers, but these days we talk about somewhere in the neighborhood of 750. We have many large farms that have both full-time and seasonal staff. Our largest farm probably employs at certain times of year in excess of 1,000, 1,200 employees. Our farms range from 5 acres to 3,000 acres. Our farms are very dependent upon migrant labor, as so many larger agricultural commodities. The mountain industry is largely a wholesale business, but we do have 200 of those 750 growers in the mountains that also operate choose and cut farms. So they'll sell trees wholesale. They may use other marketing avenues that I talk about, and then at least some families, some members of the family, stay home and operate choose and cut farms while all the rest is still going on. You know, even though it's a bigger business in the mountain, it's still family farms, and it's mostly Fraser Fir Christmas trees. Here you see a map of North Carolina with the mountain region in olive green, the Piedmont in tan, and the coastal plain in blue. And we see a real distinct line across between the mountains where it's Fraser Fir, and then the variety of species grown in the Piedmont and coastal plain. And these are really our dominant species: Virginia pine, eastern white pine, eastern red cedar, Leland cypress, Arizona cypress, green giant arborvitae, and then you see small numbers of various spruces. Now, I wanted to tie some of what I'm reporting in North Carolina to Tennessee and Tennessee's neighboring states. North Carolina is the bottom line, and it's in red, and certainly we're the largest producer in the Southeast, with over 4 million trees reported in the 2017 Ag Census. And again, that's probably a conservative number, with only a little more than 2/3 of farms reporting the number of trees sold. The second largest producing state in the Southeast is Virginia, with roughly 460 growers, and reported in the Ag Census were roughly 475,000 trees. And of course, a lot of that production is backing up to the North Carolina border at the higher elevations, and in many cases may involve North Carolina growers as well as Virginia growers. Tennessee is the other part of that highland area of the Southern Appalachians, and Tennessee comes in number 3 amongst Southern states for Christmas tree production. And with not quite 2/3 of the growers reporting the numbers of trees sold, Tennessee came in at 54,000 trees being harvested in 2017. So when you compare it to your other neighboring states, that's certainly a significant amount of production, but not necessarily uniform across the state. Next, I'd like to run through the Christmas tree species and some of the dominant practices. If you're needing to learn how to grow trees, this is just going to be a little survey, an overview, and you're going to need a lot more detail to really grapple with the planning process of producing your own farm. This truck here is belongs to our Department of Agriculture, and they put those sleeves on. And this truck was used this year to take the tree to the White House, which we were certainly honored to do. So Virginia pine is a perennial favorite in the Southeast. It's got a little bit coarser branching and foliage structure, but it certainly can do a good job of supporting ornaments. The problem with Virginia pine is its genetic variability, and very often there's a little bit higher cull rate of trees that just don't quite perform or create that good conical shape. It also will produce more than one flush every year, so you may have to shear it or prune it twice a year. So it's definitely a demanding crop to grow, but it can be profitable, and it can withstand the climate and conditions in much of the Piedmont and coastal plain. Eastern white pine is another popular species. It's got a softer appearance with 5 needles instead of 3, and the needles are much longer. It is a little more narrow in terms of what sites it does well at, and as a result tends to be found more in the Piedmont of North Carolina and just the upper sand hills of the coastal plain. And really we see a transition as we get to our deeper sandy soils away from white pine more towards Virginia pine. Eastern red cedar was probably the dominant Christmas trees throughout much of the Southeast 50 or 60 years ago. It's still considered one of those traditional species, and a lot of choose and cut farms will have some, never too many. It can be kind of prickly, and while many of us like the smell of it, others may find the smell a little bit peculiar. So it's just part of the mix. Arizona cypress, there are a couple of different varieties that are predominant in North Carolina. One of those is Carolina sapphire that has this nice blue-green color. You know, Arizona cypress can be a little bit particular in terms of sites and does well on a lot of farms, but then some growers end up with some frost injury and, you know, may not get every tree to a harvestable stage. I think it does have opportunity as greenery material if you don't shear it so tight that foliage color is very attractive mixed in with other types of greenery. Another selection of Arizona cypress is blue ice. It's even a paler blue, almost white. And we've had growers that have had some fairly large blocks of blue ice and been very pleased with them. Both the Arizona cypresses have, again, I'll say an unusual smell. Some people find it attractive and others may not. So the cypresses can kind of hit folks differently. Scots pine is a very rare tree in North Carolina. We see a lot of problems with several different diseases, and there's a lot of blocks of Scotch pine that have been planted that were never harvested. So if you're going to grow Scots pine, you really need to have good pesticide sprayers and keep up with your fungicide program. In the past, it was the bottom rung of pricing in terms of Christmas trees, but now its availability is much more scarce. I'd say its prices are very competitive with any of the other species. Norway spruce used to be grown quite a lot as a Christmas tree. Very often that was because you couldn't get anything else. It's a beautiful tree with a dense branch pattern. It tends to have a short needle. It tends not to have excellent needle retention. So it really needs to be harvested late, and you can baby it and it can perform well, but it's not got a real long shelf life. Leland Cypress has been a dominant species in North Carolina, and I think many southern states. Pruned regularly, it really thickens up and can create a very dense tree. It requires 2, sometimes 3 prunings a year. Unfortunately, over time, there have been some diseases which have developed, and so it does also require a fairly careful pest management program. In many cases, a replacement for Leland cypress, green giant, is becoming very popular. It doesn't have quite the same branch structure that Leland has, but it's still a very pretty tree and has that same bright green color. Right now, it does not seem to have the same pest issues that we see with Leland cypress. The other thing about green giant is it's very popular in the landscape as well as in the living room as a Christmas tree. So you really could take that plant in 2 market directions. Now I'd like to wax poetical as I talk about Fraser Fir. Fraser Fir, of course, has a very pleasing aroma, very dark blue-green foliage. It naturally produces a Christmas tree shape, but of course the growers help that shape along. It does have strong branches for holding ornaments, but its most important characteristic is excellent post-harvest needle retention. That allows growers to be harvesting it in late October and early November, depending on the weather, and have it hold up well on into January. However, Fraser Fir is very site selective. That's not a pile of sawdust, that's a pile of dead Fraser firs. Fraser Fir is native to elevations above 5,000 feet. It's kind of a remnant species after the one of the last ice ages, and is very closely related to Canaan fir and balsam fir. While it's native to over 5,000 feet, we commonly grow the tree from 2,000 to 4,500 feet. And we're already growing the tree off of its ideal range. A lot of our concerns about site selection are driven actually by Phytophthora root rot. We've done a good job of spreading the disease around the land on which the crop is grown, and we see the worst problems with high clay content, shallow soils, and periods of time when we have too much water, such as multiple hurricanes in a single fall. Now, I'll talk a little more about this, but you can substitute Fraser fir with canane fir or grafted exotic fir rootstocks, and we have growers that are moving through disease issues by using those techniques. There are a number of promising exotic fir species, and this slide, I just have the list, and then also the picture of a mature Turkish fir that I was able to see at Graver Arboretum up in Pennsylvania. And we think of a Christmas tree as being something in the 6 to 7 foot range, but sometime I think it's important to remember just how beautiful these trees are when they're mature. And of course, when we bring them into the living room, this is what we're trying to mimic. So in terms of North American species, we have balsam fir, canane fir, concolor or white fir, and then some growers are using some cork bark fir from Arizona. We're also looking at a number of Mediterranean fir species, including Nordman, Turkish, and Trojan fir. And we also would like to be able to use several Asian species. Momi fir has been a desirable rootstock for generations. Our grandfathers knew that they could get fir to survive in places if they grafted it onto a Momi rootstock. And it's still important in the grafted plant trade. And you can find it, but it's difficult to find. Himalayan fir probably Himalayan fir probably represents the highest level of Phytophthora root rot resistance, but the seed is absolutely unavailable. And it exists, but we're not able to get it in North America. I also mentioned Korean fir. It is available. It does make a beautiful tree with a lot of white wax on the underside of the needles and a bright green color. It is not particularly resistant to Phytophthora root rot. So I wanted to just briefly mention experimenting with true firs. We do have species with greater Phytophthora resistance, and this is primarily looking at the species of fungus Cinnamomi. We do have a number of different Phytophthora species, and they all have their own complex. So unfortunately, the world is often more complicated than a single study. But the rootstock for Fraser firs, or you can also grow them as full trees, include Momi fir, Trojan fir, Turkish fir, Nordman fir, and canane fir. And Momi fir probably has the greatest level of resistance, followed by the Trojan. But with all of these, it's really a potential for resistance, not guaranteed. We've discovered that resistance largely using progeny tests, and when you buy from a seed orchard, many times that's based upon tree appearance, not any genetic characteristic or inherent disease resistance. So very often sources of seedlings are based upon a reputation rather than a real progeny test. And so you've got to distinguish between the hype. And the truth is, you buy plants because they're available. And if you can get a Turkish or Trojan fir, it's going to do better than a Fraser fir. It may not be 100%, but it's the best you can do. in time, I hope that the science will catch up and that we have reputable seed orchards that are based upon progeny tests, where we do know the actual level of disease resistance. And in that case, we might be able to eventually push that up to better than 95%. But speaking in today's scenario, if you were wanting to plant true firs and you had a farm that you thought was clean, there was no real indication that you would have Phytophthora there, but you're not necessarily in an ideal site for Fraser fir, I would probably opt for the Canaan fir, which generally is going to be more available. A little bit more about the true fir experiments. We've done studies in eastern North Carolina, and they've not been altogether promising. Quickly, spring is sprung too early, and we often have bud abortion and frost damage. The summers have often been too hot and more than what the grower's irrigation system could handle and the needs of the tree. So we've had heat and drought stress and stunted growth. In some cases, the soils were either too clayey, too wet, or too sandy and too well drained. Where we have had irrigation from surface ponds, very often there's disease in those ponds, and other crops may not show it, but you put it on a true fir and you find out that there's a problem. So some of these growers are still waiting for the payoff. There's a lot of hope for true firs, but the truth is they're a high elevation, northern latitude crop. We talk about a 3,000-foot elevation rule of thumb for Fraser fir, but rules truly were made to be broken, and North Carolina growers break them all the time. But if you're going to break the rules, you better experiment with a manageable number of seedlings that you can afford to lose, because you don't know the consequences until you've gotten a little farther on the learning curve. So tree species selection for your farm is critical, and site selection is fundamental to everything else that's going to occur in a Christmas tree patch after the trees are planted. So those limiting factors, what are they for each species? You know, some of these I've already mentioned. Early bud break in a species puts you at risk of bud abortion and spring freezes. And you know, balsam and Canaan fir are notorious for early bud break. Summer droughts and high temperatures, a lot of these fir trees are shallow rooted and they just can't handle it. As mentioned, clay soils, too much rain, and root rot all go hand in hand. But we don't just think about water drainage, we also think about air drainage. And there are diseases that thrive on humid conditions, canker diseases and needle cast diseases. And so very often a farmer does have control over air drainage, and it might be a matter of harvesting some timber at the lower end of a field so that humid air can flow out, or you open it up towards prevailing wind to have better air circulation. And then this isn't really a site factor, but farmers really need to have the capacity to control insect and mite pests with appropriate pesticides using commercial quality sprayers. It's an intensive crop, and to try to do it with less, you know, you can do everything else right and still have pest problems that diminish the quality of your crop. So kind of in summary for the discussion about different species, here's a list of trees that would work well for most of Tennessee. Obviously, this would be different from the high country abutting North Carolina. You know, we've mentioned this, the pines include white pine, Virginia pine, and Scotch pine. The scale needle trees include green giant arborvitae, Thuya species. Leland Cypress, Arizona Cypress selections, and Eastern Red Cedar. And the green giant is actually a hybrid of a couple different Thuya species. And then in terms of the spruces, there are many species, but the dominant ones are Norway spruce and Colorado blue spruce, which requires a higher pH. And then there are people that have been experimenting some with Myers spruce and then also Serbian spruce. I wanted to use Fraser fir production as an example, and really, while there's differences, the types of activities that occur through the year and over the rotation are common to almost all tree species. With Fraser fir, you can have up to a 15-year cycle from seed to harvest. It starts with 3 years in a bare root seed bed, 2 years in a transplant bed, 8 to 10 years in the field. It requires a full range of annual cultural and pest management practices, and finishes up with the need for complex individual marketing. It's hard to do it well as a hobby, and it quickly can become a very full-time operation. Here's some pictures of different seedling production. On the side, covered with shade cloth, you see a seed bed. That first year, under natural bare root seedling conditions, Fraser fir will grow about 1 inch tall. That's 1 inch. In the middle, you see a bed that's been there for 3 years outdoors, and those plants will range in the 6 to 8 inch range, and they have 1 whorl of branches. That would be considered a 3-0 seedling. 3 years in a seed bed, 0 in a transplant bed. And then in the greenhouse, you see a young crop of Fraser fir seedlings being grown in soilless media. And a lot of our industry is moving into greenhouse production. If you use well water and soilless media and have your crop up on benches, it's an excellent way to break the disease cycle and avoid having any contamination of Phytophthora root rot in your greenhouse. Here I show transplant beds and field planting. Most of our field grown transplant are set on about 6 inch spacing and put into raised beds, and you can see the seedlings being planted above, and you can see a mature crop of 14 to 18 inch tall, 14 to 18 inch tall 3-2 transplants ready for lifting in the spring. On the other side, you see a couple of shots of field planting. We do see a fair amount of machine planting. You can see the tight spacing in the row. Those are probably destined to be tabletop trees. And down below, you see hand planting. The seedlings are brought to the field with the tractor, but those plants are being set by spade. Now, they used a subsoiler or tree planter to cross-check and so that the trees can be on a uniform 5x5 square. Here's a young plantation in winter. You can see from all the weeds that the grower wasn't that concerned about having some broadleaf weeds in the field. We do try to move away from grasses more towards broadleaf ground cover that's less damaging and competitive to the trees. Here's some pictures of older plantations, one in winter with the frost on the trees, and then some trees that'll be ready for market, growing quite close together, probably on 5x5 foot spacing. Those trees are generally fertilized every year. We pay a lot of attention to our soil reports, and it's important to really optimize both lime and fertilizer levels in the soil. These workers are applying fertilizer by hand, and they can put about a 50-pound bag in that backpack fertilizer spreader. The other picture shows a couple of men that are pruning the Christmas trees in midsummer using long, sharp serrated knives, not too different from a bread knife. And almost all the Fraser firs are sheared that way by hand, and they'll work the top with a set of clippers. Fraser fir integrated pest management is critical to having a good crop. We have several major pests that include scales, aphids, mites, and adelgids. And we try to base our pesticide applications on field scouting data. And all of that was working really well until some regulatory pests became increasingly important. And these pests are actually less likely to kill a tree, but they can stop a tractor trailer load at the state border. And because of that, we actually see growers using more pesticides now than we did 10 years ago. In these pictures, in the top corner, that's a balsam twig aphid. In the middle is a spruce spider mite. And at the bottom, you see the white flecks or woolly material created by balsam woolly adelgid. And those are some of our key pest problems. I wanted to just mention ground cover management. In the mountains, we rely a lot on herbicides, and we've learned how to use very low rates of glyphosate or Roundup. And if we manage it correctly, we can have a crop of white clover growing between the Christmas trees. And we've not only developed that technology for use with backpack sprayers, we've also learned how to spray Roundup over actively grown Fraser fir trees, as you can see here with the Cannon mist blower. And finishing up our cycle of production, here's some trees that are tagged for harvest. We have wholesale farms that have crews tagging trees from mid-July all the way to the middle of October. And here's some pictures of harvest. You know, the trees are cut and dragged down to the roads in the field, and then they're baled and loaded on a lowboy trailer. The trees are then stored on the farm in a storage yard in the shade. And you can see them being loaded by elevator onto a tractor trailer. Often that's something in the neighborhood of 800 trees per load. Our wholesale harvest stretches over about a 3 to 5 week window. Most growers handle trees about 7 times before they leave the farm. Growers have post-harvest quality concerns and go to extra effort to try to keep trees fresh. Major growers may start harvest in late October, but often wait till early November, and that can be a real challenge. You can see the lull equipment. They use that to unload lowboy trailers, and then they've got palletizers to compress trees onto a pallet shape and ship those in enclosed trailers. So as you look at other species grown in North Carolina and throughout the South, there are differences from Fraser fir. Farmers tend to plant them at wider row spacing. They tend to plant fewer trees per acre as a result. They rely more on mowing with small equipment and rely less on the herbicides. I believe that they could save money with the integrated approach, allowing herbicides to do more of the work. Many of the farmers rely on mechanical versus hand shearing and pruning. There are a host of different pests by each tree species, and it's important to know which ones you have to manage for. Growers of these different pines in particular will use color enhancement, different paints, to turn trees green that would normally turn yellow with cold weather. These trees often do not have the same needle retention that Fraser Fir has, so they're not harvested for wholesale. Their harvest window usually starts about Thanksgiving, that's to keep them fresh. And they also may have a shorter display window and be ready to be taken down by the end of the year, as opposed to holding up through the end of January or longer. And you can see a grower holding the Beneke rotary pruner wand, and that's what a lot of growers use to shear both the pines and the cypresses. I've got a slide in here for the Christmas tree colorants. The pines really do turn yellowy green. And so there's some shades of green that really make the tree look natural. A lot of farmers will apply it in September so that it has a chance to weather and look a little more natural. But, we've got people that are, real strong sports fans. And so depending on your team's favorite color, you can find orange or crimson red or whatever color your team uses. So that's a way to take a real tree and turn it into an artificial tree. I wanted to just mention a few of the southern insects and diseases. Pine tip moth on Virginia pine, pine bark adelgid on white pine, bagworms on scale needle trees can be a problem. We also see Cinera aphids, spider mites, Paley's weevil. And so there's certainly things that you have to be watching out for, and many of them are very small. Phytophthora root rot is not limited to just Fraser fir. It can occur on multiple tree species, and white pine is susceptible and has problems, particularly when small. Several of the needle cast diseases can plague trees, and probably the winner in that category would be Scots pine. Leland Cypress has issues with Passiflora needle blight, Ceridium canker, and also Botrosphaera canker. I wanted to briefly talk about some of the Christmas tree markets. I have a book on my shelf at my office that discusses over 60 different ways you can sell a Christmas tree. And it was written about 60 years ago. Here in the top corner, you see a Christmas tree getting squeezed into a box. That is a mail order business, and those trees command a great price, but a whole lot of money goes towards the shipping in the box. But when times are tight, we do see growers getting into the mail order business. One of the strong market segments is garden centers, and they tend to have a reputation for highest quality trees and good service. And we have wholesale growers that target that market. In the bottom corner, you see an independent retail lot. They used to be the bread and butter of our industry across the country, often run by individuals or families or civic groups. And they're still an important part of the industry, but like so many commodities, they've been overshadowed by the sales in box or chain stores. And chain stores have led with low price and lower quality tree in many cases, but you can still find beautiful trees there. I've got a whole slide just for choose and cut farms. This is really becoming one of the dominant markets for the Christmas tree industry across the country. And it has a very varied face depending on farm to farm and family involvement and the trees being grown. But there are commonalities, as you can see here. And they're very much an ambassador for the entire industry. And a lot of what they do is focus on agritourism, or the experience that consumers have when buying a farm product. And very often there are different types of hayride, there are different types of crafts, or maybe a store, or even an arts gallery on the farm. They're often producing greenery where consumers can watch the wreath being made. Sometimes Santa comes, particularly on the weekends. And you know, if you have a love of animals, there's no reason not to share some of those animals as a petting zoo. Of course, people have gotten a little bit afraid of liability issues, but there's certainly a lot of creativity as you focus on the experience beyond just the product, the Christmas tree. The value of agritourism, as you think about it as a model, is it's not just about one crop. It's not just about one season. A farm may have structures that can be rented out. We have farmers that focus on wedding planning. A lot of farms will have a harvest season where they focus on pumpkins or apples, and actually that can be stronger than the Christmas trees. You can add to harvest seasons by putting up corn mazes, and those can be a real strong attraction. If you've got any wonderful old barns or buildings on the farm, we have farms that have really focused on kind of a heritage theme. So, Southern Christmas tree markets. You know, when you look at Fraser Fir with the addition of wholesale, there's lots of choices. You know, independent retailers, garden centers, chain stores, targeted fundraisers, civic groups and churches, selling to other growers or re-wholesalers. And all of that is ongoing. On the retail side of things, they can also have choose and cut farms. But growers can also ship trees to another state and operate a grower-operated retail lot. And of course, they know how to take care of their trees, and they have a vested interest. And so often you can find the freshest trees at a grower-operated retail lot. And I showed you the slide of the mail order business as another retail option for Fraser Fir growers. But it's not just the trees. Wreaths, roping, and decorations make up a huge part, and we estimate that it may be 25 to 30% of the total market going into greenery products that can be sold wholesale or retail. When you look at the southern species, it tends to be focused more just on the retail side, more just on choose and cut at the farm, and very often tree species grown by the farmer are augmented with cut Fraser Fir or another species of wholesale tree. And it can create a clear kind of market model that is easy for small farms to follow. Now, I wanted to briefly talk a little bit about income potential, and I think some of you may be surprised. Everybody thinks that Fraser Fir is the premium species and that Fraser Fir growers are up on top of the mountain and getting the best of the industry. If you look at wholesale Fraser Fir, you have quite a few trees per acre. A mid-sized grower will typically use 5x5 spacing, producing something in the neighborhood of 1,500 trees to the acre. A major grower is going to crowd and grow a faster, smaller diameter tree, as many as 2,800 per acre. If you look at prices this year, I upped the wholesale prices to $30 to $40 wholesale. But you got to remember, just a few years ago, those farmers were getting $4 to $5 for the same tree. So there is a fair amount of volatility. If you take 15,000 trees to the acre and multiply it by the high price, you could gross $60,000 per acre for a small to mid-sized wholesaler. If you took 2,800 trees and multiplied it by a lower price, and I used $25, you could generate $70,000 per acre. So actually more money for the major grower because it's more trees. Are we all still together? So you look at $9 to $15 and take that cost out of the tree, and income potential to the farmer is estimated at a net of $37,000 to maybe $45,000 per acre. Now, you think about the markets being cyclical and the fact that there are periods of times where you're not going to get those good prices. We saw a real exodus of small and older growers. The oversupply is still very much on people's minds. Americans still love their plastic tree. Real trees only represent about 20% of the national market at this point in time. We have seen fewer growers, about 18% in 2017 compared to 2012, but the growers that we have are actually making more money. So that really is a good story for farmers, because they can come into
Bring it to me, Blair. Can I try it?
I'm sorry?
Oh, okay.
So now let's look at income potential for choose and cut. There are going to be fewer trees per acre at a wider spacing. The tree prices are retail prices, not wholesale, so more money. And if you take the lower tree spacing by the lower price, that could give you as little as $48,000 gross. At the high end, with more trees per acre and a higher price, you could have as much as $88,000 gross per acre. So that's a lot of money to gross per acre. But you still have cost per tree, $10 to $15, depending on the grower. If you look at one rotation, after the cost, you could be making $36,000 to $71,000 per acre. But you're looking at rotations that are shorter than a Fraser fir. You can harvest Leland Cypress in as little as 4 years, but often it's going to be more like 5 or 6. So you could get 2 rotations possibly over 10 to 12 years. And if you think about that, you could be generating between $70,000 and $140,000 off of that acre of land if you were to completely harvest it. And of course, that's a little bit of an imaginary scenario. Usually you may be harvesting several fields over several years. So, regardless of whether it's pie in the sky, there are a lot of growers that have said that they, as a couple, the grower and their wife, had been able to pay off the house and farm and send the kids to college with what they made on the Christmas trees. And that's the kind of impact it can have as a part-time business. But, we got to worry about counting chickens before they hatch. What does the future hold 10 years from now? The wholesale markets have been cyclical. Sales often reflect the strength of the economy. And so if country is in bad times, individual sales on farms can be kind of tough as well. And then if you have a bad year in terms of weather, your sales can be affected. So we often see fluctuations year to year based upon the weather. But the choose and cut market segment has steadily increased nationwide over the last 30 years. It appears to be somewhat sheltered, if not completely immune, from the vagaries of the wholesale market. So, it's been much more stable. I think it's important, though, to pay attention to different drivers. The local economy may vary. If you have a plant closing, for instance, that's going to affect local choose and cut farms. You're also competing with other local farms, and are there the right number of farms or too many? You may be competing with retail lots that come in from an area like the mountains of North Carolina. On the positive side, I've seen tourism campaigns really make a difference. If you can create a sense of travel destination, a rising tide rises all ships. And we've seen some real benefit in resort areas where people will come and get a Christmas tree in the season. And of course, the local weather is always a driver as well. Does it work well for choose and cut? And as you move further north, it can be really cold when people are out picking a tree. And that's an advantage southern farms have over our northern growers. So, we talk about all of that, and ultimately it comes down to how do competing farms in a region right size to consumer demand. And I don't have a crystal ball. You don't have a crystal ball. If you can build a business plan, you may come closer to seeing into the future. So growing your operation, how big can you dream? And we have successful farms at every stage. And you're a success if you're doing what you want. Small farms may be family run with a few hundred trees. Slightly larger, you have seasonal staff. You may have several thousand trees. You may not be selling several thousand trees. It still may be in the hundreds, but it's going to be certainly a little more busy. Even larger, you may be thinking beyond just the crop of Christmas trees. You may be looking at a wedding and event center with an agricultural theme. You may be targeting a larger metropolitan area. And we have one or two farms in North Carolina that can sell over 5,000 trees in a year. As you go into the Northeast, there are farms that are selling 6,000, 8,000, maybe even more than that in a single growing season, and selling them all by ones and twos. That takes a huge staff to make that work. But even bigger, we have some farms that have an expanded agritourism plan and enterprise, and they have multiple crops and extended seasons. And it's more like an agricultural amusement park. So that represents a big spread. Whatever you decide to do, it should be about what makes the farmer and his or her family happy. And if that's the case, then it's a successful farm. So what is the unmet potential in your region or in your metro area? Now, to support this kind of study, there are excellent agritourism examples free to study on the internet. You can go look at Roba's Christmas tree farm up in Pennsylvania and see the kinds of things they do. You can look at other farms up in the Pacific or in the New England area, or a neighbor down the road. So what is right for you? Before you jump and get into the Christmas tree business, see it in action. Visit several existing growers in your region, especially during the retail harvest season. And usually if they're not right next door, they'll probably be pretty friendly because they don't see you as direct competition. I would also encourage you to join state and national grower associations. They're a great place to learn. They're a chance to visit competitors' farms on farm tours. Benefits can include crop promotion, networking, and influence with ag leaders that can be important as your industry navigates into the future. It gives you a chance to connect with your peers and your community. And eventually it may lead into leadership roles that can provide a number of different intangible benefits. We have two major associations in North Carolina. I'm moving towards my conclusions. I wanted to just quickly talk about picking a fresh tree. And first of all, picking a fresh tree is not about its shape. Beauty is definitely in the eye of the beholder, and Charlie Brown thought his tree was beautiful too. Freshness is separate from that. Freshness is a defined characteristic that can be measured as a percent of water content in the tree. And generally, the drier the tree, the less fresh it is. Trees are perishable, and fresh is a moving target that's dependent upon tree care. If you're looking at pre-cut trees that have been handled through the wholesale shipping process, look for the following things. You want your tree to be relatively heavy. That means it's full of water. You want your foliage to be relatively cool to the touch. Again, that's a sign that there's water in that branch. Ideally, your tree should have a dark green color for most true firs and pines. If the tree is blanched and pale or yellow, those should be warning flags. The branches and twigs and needles should all be supple and sway when you brush them and not feel stiff and sharp. Now, of course, there's species differences. You know, Colorado blue spruce will be very stiff. When you look at the bark on the twigs, it should be smooth and not wrinkled. Wrinkled can be an indication of drying. And your trees should have good needle retention, unlike these here in the picture. And while you're still on the retail lot, make sure you get a fresh cut off the base of that tree. That gives you a clean surface and can improve water uptake. And that tree care message can be carried home as well. And when you get that tree home, whether it's from a choose and cut farm or from a retailer as pre-cut, get that tree in water as soon as possible. And whether you're putting it in its final tree stand or whether you're just going to store it for a couple of days, store it in water. Use a tree stand that has a big water reservoir that won't go dry in a few hours. Make sure you don't use any of the so-called Christmas tree preservatives or home remedies. Just use clean water. Those things add salt and they can aggravate needle drop. Keep water in the tree stand continuously. Avoid sunny display locations, particularly facing south. Avoid all and any heat sources that can dry the tree out. Now, in my living room, like you see here, we put a piece of plywood over our central air heat vent that is close to the tree. Now, I want to say no Christmas tree ever started a fire, and well-hydrated trees do resist burning. Other things start fires, and if you have a dry tree, it can be fuel, and that certainly is a concern. But you know, let's be honest, we got to look to our electrical system and the way we stress that system in our house during this holiday season. So make sure you inspect and update electrical tree light strings. Don't use old lights. Preferably shift to new LED lights that can use far less than 5% of the power and put much less load on receptacles compared to old-fashioned incandescent bulbs. And if you do those things, you should have a nice tree that lasts into the new year. So Merry Christmas. Any questions?